Hi, Peter.
How you doing?
Okay. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
I'm holding it up to the camera, so even as we speak, Amazon.com's servers being flooded, which is good.
Good.
Peter Beinart, The Good Fight. Why liberals and only liberals can win the war on terror and make America great again. Peter, in preparing for this, I was doing a little searching around the web, and I've got what I think will not be news for you. There's a lot of people on the left who really don't like you.
Yes, I noticed that.
Have you noticed that? And it's related to this book. And I think maybe a way to start exploring their seemingly inexplicable dislike for someone I know to be eminently likable is to talk about the context, the way the book came into being. Now, in my experience, the book you set out to write is never the book exactly that you wind up writing. But in your case, it does seem to me that the gap is wider than average. You know what I mean? I can elaborate. But let me just tell you how, because this was a book that, unlike many books, got a lot of attention when you started writing it, right? Because it was an extension of an essay in the New Republic that got a lot of attention.
Yes.
You were editor of the New Republic, I guess, at that time, and you're still writing the TRB column.
Yes, I still am.
The essay was called "A Fighting Faith," and it was a kind of a, liberals took it as a sermon to them about what they needed to do in order to be ready to be, to fight the war on terror and to have an appealing message in the midst of a war on terror. And the way it was taken was that your message was that that liberals were not tough enough, weren't militant enough. They certainly, many of them had not supported the Iraq War, which at that point was just kind of unfolding. And then there was a second essay that I saw that came out when your book, The Good Fight, came out, the serial rights, I guess, in the New York Times Magazine.
Yes.
And it did seem to me that there was a somewhat different spin by then. I mean, in both cases, you enlisted as the role model for the liberals, the Americans for Democratic Action, I guess they were called, who in the early 60s were kind of tough-minded, Cold War hawk liberals. And you mentioned Reinhold Niebuhr in particular. But by the time the New York Times Magazine piece came out, that is to say, by the time the book itself was actually formulated, you were stressing a different side of Reinhold Niebuhr, it seemed to me. The first thing you got into in that piece was how they recognized the fallibility of America, so the ADA was humble about America's extension of power. So in other words, it sounded like a conventional liberal critique of George Bush, right?
I wouldn't quite say that. Let me try to answer your question in a couple ways. The first thing is that essay that I wrote, A Fighting Faith, in December 2004, was only addressed to liberals. It basically ignored my criticism of conservatives, partly because I felt like that was more self-evident, and I spent a lot of my TRB columns doing that. So I really didn't spend any time in that essay talking about what I thought was wrong with the conservative view of the world and the view on the war on terror. So perhaps some people assumed, although they wouldn't have if they had read much of the other things I'd written, that I actually thought that somehow the neoconservatives and George W. Bush were largely right. So partly the book is just more even-handed in a sense. It spends quite a lot of time talking about, which I didn't have time to get into in the essay, and didn't think I needed to, the things that I think are legion and wrong in the conservative tradition, which I try to trace back from George W. Bush to what I think of as his kind of intellectual ancestors. Many of them have been forgotten, but people like James Burnham, the most important foreign policy thinker in the National Review circle in the 1950s.
But what are the things that should... what are the things I'm not saying about George Bush and that a lot of us weren't saying about George Bush when you started to write this book that you're saying? Let me tell you, let me read a blog item. Kevin Drum, who interviewed you recently on this book, I had been looking through the book. I still haven't read the whole thing, but I think I've kind of gotten the highlights. And I came across his blog item, and he said exactly what I felt. Here's the funny thing. He says, here's the funny thing about that. I read The Good Fight a couple of weeks ago. That you now admit you were wrong about the war. What's more, his prescription for how liberals should approach foreign policy going forward is distinctly non-martial. And the impression I got from the essay that inaugurated the writing of the book was that your whole complaint about liberalism is that we weren't militaristic enough. Kevin goes on, he believes we need a sort of modern-day Marshall Plan for the Middle East, a willingness to work with international institutions, an acceptance that we should abide by the same restrictions that we demand for others, greater patience in foreign affairs, and a rededication to social justice both at home and abroad. So, I mean, granted that there are two sides to the book. There's a critique of conservatism, and then there was, going into it, a critique of liberals. It seems to me, if there's a critique of liberalism, then there should be some part of the critique of conservatism that isn't part of the standard liberal critique.
Yes.
What is that part?
In fact, I spent a good part of a chapter explaining that. The basic framework comes from Niebuhr himself, and Niebuhr had a critique of both the right and the left. The critique of the right was this idea that people on the right had, that because America was involved in an essentially just cause against a totalitarian enemy, everything America did must have to be justified as correct. And Niebuhr argued that that kind of what he called idealism was extremely dangerous because it blinded America to its capacity to do harm. And then unless America recognized that it could do harm, it wouldn't be capable, in fact, of doing great things. But he also had a critique of the left that I think is very relevant today, that I began to talk about in that essay in December 2004, but that I elaborate on at much greater length today, which was his critique of the left's moral purity, his argument that there was a tendency among some on the left to believe that since everything America had to be morally or procedurally pure, the left was not willing to do what it took, in fact, to confront evil abroad. So the kind of famous example from the late 40s was Henry Wallace's argument that we should only support Greece and Turkey against the communists through the UN, while knowing that the UN would never do so because the Soviet Union was on the Security Council. And I say that is similar to MoveOn.org's position on the Afghan war, where they said, sure, we want to overthrow the Taliban, but not if any innocent life is taken in American bombing of Kabul. That's what Arthur Schlesinger called the dough-face fallacy, the idea that you can oppose something but not be willing to support practical action against it. And I do think that's a real concern on the left today. What you find, and I go through this in the book at some length, the polling amongst liberals, particularly in the last couple of years, on military force has become quite disturbing. I don't think that military force is the primary answer to the war on terror, but I do believe that unless liberals are willing to be seen to be willing to use military force, they will get no hearing for the other things I talk about. The polling from this MIT poll that was published in the Boston Review shows less than 60% of liberals would refight the Afghan war. Less than 60% would support a preemptive military strike against a terrorist camp. And I think that is there's other polling to that effect, and I think it's disturbing, and I critique it.
Okay, I mean, but at the time of the Afghan war, I'm pretty sure a majority of liberals supported it, right? I mean, see, I mean, your argument is kind of almost with the MoveOn.org part of the spectrum specifically, right? I mean, it's not with kind of what you're hearing from self-described liberals in think tanks, kind of, right? I mean, this view is certainly weaker in liberals and think tanks, no question about it. Those people are largely kind of Clinton administration alumni who see the Kosovo war as their kind of model, and I think they're right. But what you've seen, it's true, the vast majority of liberals supported the Afghan war and Democrats in Congress. But what you've seen in the last couple of years, the polling starts to show starting in 2004, is a really significant shift. The Center for American Progress and the Century Foundation do this poll. They ask Americans, what's your biggest foreign policy priority? For Americans as a whole, number one is destroying Al-Qaeda. For conservatives, it's number one. For self-described liberals, it's number 10. And this is starting to seep into the policy debate in Washington. I think that for instance, if you looked at the document that the congressional Democrats put out, their strong and tough, smart and tough document they put out several months ago, almost very, very little discussion of democracy promotion at all, which I think is a reflection. But Peter, I mean, not everyone agrees that democracy promotion per se is a really effective tool in the war on terror. I mean, there are two kinds of questions, and they're commonly conflated. I feel a victim of their common conflation, let me say. I mean, there are people who say liberals aren't taking the war on terror seriously enough, and then, as evidence, they cite the fact that you didn't support the war in Iraq. But Peter, I think that was kind of the tune you were singing before the war went sour. You supported the war.
Yeah, I supported the war in Iraq, but my essay in December 2004 very explicitly was not an attack on people who opposed the war in Iraq. In fact, I was attacking people who opposed the war in Afghanistan. I cited as Bob Graham and Wesley Clark as two people who I thought were coming up with valuable ideas on the war on terror, even though they opposed the war in Iraq.
But of course, by that time the war in Iraq was going pretty seriously awry, I would say.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that it's true that there are people who say that if you were against the war in Iraq, it means you don't care about the war on terror. I am not one of those people.
Yeah, but I mean, there are two. Let me say it in another way. I mean, you can have honest debate about what is effective in fighting the war on terror. And let me quote from your 2004. Your complaint is that liberals aren't focusing on the war on terror. When liberals talk about America's new era, the discussion is largely negative. Against the Iraq War, you're complaining about that. Against restrictions on civil liberties. Against America's worsening reputation in the world. There are those of us who think that one of the most important tools in the war on terror is to tend to America's reputation in the world, in the Muslim world and elsewhere in the world. So that is part of the war on terror. And here you are definitely presenting it as if this is evidence that liberals are not engaged in the war. They're being so negative. They're against restrictions on civil liberties. There are those of us who think that... But let me finish, Peter. There are those of us who think that being too lax on... that being mindlessly strict on civil liberties, especially things like ethnic profiling, are actually bad strategy in the war on terror that will have blowback. And I would say the same thing about all these things you list. You say liberals are so negative. Well, being negative on these three specific things could arguably be part of a serious platform in the war on terror.
My argument was that, in fact, that liberals had to go beyond just being against the Bush administration on those things and lay out a positive program, including arguing, as I talk about in the essay, arguing more vigorously than they have that, in fact, these civil liberties violations make America weaker around the world. One of the reasons I praised Graham and Clark was that I think they laid out a kind of a very interesting case about what America could have done instead of the war in Iraq. So, yes, I was saying that liberals, Democrats, needed to go beyond purely critiquing those points of the Bush administration for those arguments, but not because I think that liberals or Democrats should in any way have embraced what the Bush administration was doing, because I was saying that they needed to go beyond a negative critique and, in fact, lay out a positive alternative vision.
Okay. Now, on the vision, actually, there are cases in which I think you're, in a sense, insufficiently assertive. That is to say, there are problems you identify, like the spread of weapons of mass destruction. I think you appreciate that biological weapons are going to become more and more of a problem. And again, maybe I missed it. I haven't read every page of the book. But what is your program for dealing with that?
I think twofold. I think I agree with you on biological. You know more about this than me, but I read enough about this to know that while biological weapons may not be the most dangerous thing right now, in the years to come they could be a terribly frightening threat. And I think you need two kinds of things. It seems to me, first of all, more generally, you need empowered international institutions that America helps to build that have the capacity to intervene internally in other countries, to violate other countries' sovereignty in order to make sure that things are not happening within those countries that will ultimately threaten the world. That the reality of globalization is that we're threatened by things that happen inside other countries that may be done by non-state actors. But if the United States tries to unilaterally act proactively against those threats, we will become seen as an empire, and we may in fact become an empire. So that you have to do it, you have to learn the lesson of the early Cold War, which is the lesson that American power is best executed through powerful international institutions that give us legitimacy. And beyond that, I think that the war of ideas against this jihadist threat will also ultimately help us in protecting ourselves against a biological threat. People thought during the Cold War that it would be much easier to get rid of the weapons than the ideology, but in fact it turned out to be the reverse. It was easier to defeat the ideology than to get rid of the weapons.
Okay, but you also agree we're going to need unprecedentedly intrusive and comprehensive multilateral arms control, ultimately covering all the countries in the world if we're going to be safe, and that's going to involve America agreeing to weapons inspections that are more intrusive than we're accustomed to.
Absolutely. That's one of the themes of my book is that moral progress, this kind of progress requires reciprocity. That the Bush administration's view, which is that we're going to be unprecedentedly infringing upon other countries' sovereignty for democracy, human rights, anti-proliferation, but that if you start talking about what America does, we trot out John Bolton, that this is a recipe for disaster. That the more you, and Blair understands this actually much more than Bush, I think, the more America wants to accomplish around the world, the more it has to be open to recognizing that it has to be held to a higher moral moral standard at home. And that what we can't lead an anti-proliferation campaign on nuclear weapons, for instance, while we're developing a whole new class of nuclear weapons that aren't even meant for deterrence. They're meant for battlefield use. I mean, people around the world are not idiots. They recognize the rank hypocrisy in that.
And so, do you have a way you would apply this to a specific arms control issue right now, like Iran?
I think, on Iran, I would be in favor. It's still early, and I'm still trying to figure out, honestly, what I believe about Iran. But my instincts at this point, early on, would be that the United States should recognize that the primary danger is not an Iran with nuclear weapons, which we probably can't prevent, but this Iranian government with nuclear weapons. And that we should therefore think about, we should be open to talks with them in the hope that we will lure them into the international community, and that will ultimately undermine this theocratic regime. That one of the lessons of the Cold War is that democracies shouldn't be afraid to try to wait out dictatorships, because dictatorships are often weaker internally than they appear on the surface.
Okay. Now, there's something you kind of insist on in the book, which is that we conceive of this as a fight against totalitarianism. And this is, of course, kind of links your position to your historical argument that the glory days of liberals were in the early 60s, when the more far-seeing of them, rallied against totalitarianism and were vigilant in the Cold War. I have some hesitation about that term. It seems to me it obscures a lot and can be misleading. And it seems to me one big difference is this, that although the people we're fighting can be said in many cases to have a totalitarian ideology, none of them right now are actually in control of states. And there's a big difference between fighting totalitarians who are governing states and those who aren't. And let me just give you one example. You hear a lot about public diplomacy. And you often hear that this is part of the Cold War that we should emulate. But the situation now is very different. I mean, in the Cold War, because of totalitarianism, we had these people whose allegiance we were trying to win in the Soviet Union and so on, who were being denied access to the information that they wanted. So, by their totalitarian government. So clearly, if you could provide good information, you would get their attention. Well, now the people in the Middle East, by and large, have freedom of choice on information. They're not being forced to watch Al Jazeera. That's a source of information they find credible, and actually largely with good reason. It's as close to credibility as some news outlets in America, I'd say. And so we can. There's just not a good analogy with kind of Radio Free Europe and that kind of stuff. I mean, you see that the issue I have there?
Well, you're absolutely right, of course, that this totalitarianism takes radically different form, because it's in the form of a kind of an ideology, of a kind of a loose network, if you will, not in a state. And I discuss that at some length in the book. I think that the vision of the state is similar in the sense that it has the core totalitarian characteristic as defined by Hannah Arendt and others, which is the idea that you use coercive state power to crush all independent civil society in an attempt to purify the society, ultimately purify human nature in pursuit of a kind of a utopian messianic vision. I think it's important to understand that that's the vision for which the jihadists are fighting. But you're right. The fact that they don't have state power means that you have to fight them in some very different ways. It's important to remember that a lot of the public diplomacy that we did during the Cold War was not only based at people who were behind the Soviet Iron Curtain. It was based at people in the Third World, for instance, or even in Western Europe, who did have access to information. The case that America was trying to make was that America was a force for freedom and economic development, and that in fact America was involved in a freedom struggle at home, which was extremely important in how we communicated to people around the world. But I should say on public diplomacy, which is actually not a term that I think appears in my book maybe at all. I am not a believer. I'm not a believer that we're going to win this war simply by speaking differently. I'm a believer that I think we're going to win this war by acting differently. I think that one of the Bush administration's great mistakes is thinking that we can simply brand America better while doing a lot of things that people are rightly outraged about. It's less public diplomacy than American action.
Okay. Let me ask you a question about the Iraq War. You do a kind of if you look in the index under Iraq in your book, one of the the subheadings is authors misguided support of, or something like that. Authors mistaken support of, or something. You do a little mea culpa in the preface or in the introduction. And I want to take issue with one of your... You talk about what your mistaken premises were. You said, I supported the war because I considered it the only remaining way to prevent Saddam Hussein from obtaining a nuclear bomb. Now, Peter, as you may recall, at the time we launched the war, we had gotten the United Nations inspectors into Iraq, and they were being allowed to look wherever they wanted. So, and it seems to me there's no doubt, I mean, the world was desperate for us to hold off that invasion. That if we had said, look, we'll hold off if you'll quadruple the inspection force and give them another 18 months to look around, there's no doubt that we could have gotten a completely thorough scouring of Iraq. So,
did you read my chapter on Iraq?
I kind of skimmed it, but I mean,
because that's precisely my point. The reason that I said that I was wrong and that I could have known that perhaps I could not have known in the fall of 2002 that Saddam didn't have a nuclear weapons program, that it was reasonable to believe based on his history then. But by February and March of 2003, we were learning enough from the international inspectors to begin to know that, in fact, maybe he really didn't. The evidence was mounting. And that's precisely part of the basis of my mea culpa, was that, in fact, I think I became locked into an assumption that he must have nuclear weapons, going back to his behavior before the Gulf War, based on a certain consensus that existed amongst people who knew a fair amount, to be fair. But I was not willing to revise that as the information came out from the IAEA in February and March of 2003. So I don't think we have a disagreement here.
Okay, good. There is a paragraph, though, where you say, ultimately, we would have had to confront, he would have kicked the inspectors out or something, and we would have had to confront Saddam Hussein, I think the issue of whether he's containable.
I think we would have had to contain Saddam Hussein. Yeah, I don't think Saddam Hussein would have allowed the weapons inspectors. My guess is that Saddam Hussein probably would have kicked the weapons inspectors out sooner or later. Remember, Saddam wanted the world to think he had these weapons, partly maybe vis-a-vis the Iranians, partly for the survival of his own regime. My suspicion is eventually he would have kicked the weapons inspectors out, and we would have had to recast the containment effort so that we could have outlasted Saddam. There's no guarantee it would have worked, but it would have been better than going to the war the way we did in March 2003, which I mistakenly supported.
Yeah, and he would not have kicked them out, I think, while troops were poised on the border. I mean, we could have so set him back that we could have kicked the can way down the road, and you'd probably agree with that. But listen, this is great to hear you saying this, because I've made this argument to so many... I mean, look, at the time, Peter, I was completely baffled. And I remember I had this experience. I did a piece for you, for the New Republic. You weren't editing it, but at the time the war started. And I said, this is a big mistake. I mean, remember, the inspectors, we had the inspectors there, they were looking wherever they wanted. And I was getting like kind of some editorial resistance on this point. I mean, honestly, it was like I had to really like argue that this was actually the case. And there was some kind of weird mind warping going on, not only at the New Republic, but across the spectrum of American support for the war. It was like being in the Twilight Zone. I mean, and you yourself must have trouble reconstructing what your frame of mind was, because it does seem kind of clear-cut in retrospect, right? The inspectors were there.
Well, yes, it depends on when. I mean, I think that one of the things that happened is that people took a position on the Iraq War in the fall. I mean, that's when Congress was voting, and at that point, look, at that point we knew very little about what was going on in Iraq. I mean, the intelligence estimates were very vague, and they were being exaggerated by the Bush administration. But there was still, by and large, a fairly wide consensus amongst a lot of Clinton administration alumni and amongst some other intelligence agencies that, yeah, Saddam was probably trying to get a nuclear weapon. We hadn't been able to see what he was doing for the last 4 years, and it was consistent with his history.
Sure.
But I think that the failure was not to be. I would call it a failure on my part of intellectual imagination. The failure of imagination to see that, in fact, we were starting to get bits and pieces of information. I wrote a column in January 2003, I remember very clearly, in which I attacked the Bush administration for going ahead with this uranium and this aluminum tubes claims, because I had done some research, and I said, these look very flimsy. They're going to undermine support for the war by coming out with this lousy evidence for a nuclear program. They need to show the strong evidence for a nuclear program, but I assumed it was there. And you're right, that was a real failure, I think, of a kind of imagination, and I congratulate you for seeing through it.
Thank you. And I mean, look, you're right. Early, I mean, nobody knew for sure. But the point was, in principle, yeah, they could stay there for a very long time and get to the bottom of things. I want to. I promise to get back to the issue of why people on the left don't like you. I mean, first of all, I think we're kind of getting clear. I think to some extent they have, on a certain part of the left-wing spectrum, they have a valid reason to dislike you, at least in the sense that they are the ones you're criticizing. I mean, you know.
My 2004 essay criticized MoveOn.org and Michael Moore specifically. And in the book, I criticized them. I take specific statements they made. And I also criticized George Lakoff for some things he said. And The Nation. I'm trying to think if there's anybody else. Those are basically the people. And then I say that there's an increasing amount of polling data which suggests that some of these kind of views are becoming more prominent amongst American liberals, amongst Democrats in public opinion data.
Yeah, but
so when people say that, I think I've been trying to be fairly careful in the book and in the essay about criticizing specific people and quoting chapter and verse.
Yeah, but you know, kind of aggregate American opinion is I mean, most people don't pay much attention to the news, so it kind of tracks events in such a crude way. Most people are growing kind of reluctant about military intervention because the Iraq thing has blown up in our face, and Afghanistan is even starting to head south. And it's a kind of vague reaction to that, I think, that you're seeing. I mean,
but you're seeing, Bob, it's not equally distributed. The MIT survey asked, would you refight the Afghan war? Republicans, 94 or 95%. Democrats, somewhere 57 or 59%. I can't remember which one it is. It's true that the country is weary. There's no question about it. Yeah. But it's playing out with a very distinct partisan spin, which is exactly what happened in the wake of Vietnam. And that had very debilitating consequences for the left, as you know.
There's no doubt that the right is more hawkish. And look, I agree. I mean, I am, as you may know, I was worried about this stuff before 9/11. I was writing about weapons of mass destruction for the New Republic when you were a young tyke.
I remember.
It's a hard. I mean, rhetorically, the Democrats are in, my view, if you take my view of it, you're in a difficult problem rhetorically because on the one hand, you want to rally people to the urgency of the cause, but on the other hand, the solution or the response you're calling for is actually a subtle combination of complex, policies, and it's not the easy, like, okay, there's 3 countries we can invade solution.
No.
I think even by your own lights, it's probably a difficult rhetorical problem the Democrats face, right?
Well, I guess I'd answer that. First of all, luckily, you and I are not running for office. I don't mean that just as a joke.
Actually, in a dialogue with Mickey that I just taped...
You are running for office.
I denied that I was running for office, but in an attempt to fan rumors that I was. So speak for yourself. We were actually talking about this attempt to start a third party via, an online third party.
Well,
so I'm trying to set the waves in motion, so talk it up. But go ahead, sorry.
A Bob Wright candidacy would needless to say be something very exciting for all of us. But one of the things that I think really inhibits, and I think this is particularly more true actually on the left and on the right, that inhibits people from talking about what they really believe is this constant view that somehow, how are we going to sell it to the American people? Conservatives did not worry when they founded National Review in 1955, or even when Barry Goldwater ran in 1964, or even when the Heritage Foundation was created in 1973, so much about the fact that they were out of the mainstream. What they focused on was trying to figure out what they believed, a set of core principles, and then put that into policy with the belief that if they kept making a good case, that the American people might someday come around. So I'm not worried about running for office. I do think that there are themes that one can talk about, particularly about the need to make America live up to the ideals that it preaches. What I hear all over and over from people around the world is, when are we going to get our America back? When are we going to get the America? Not that they're looking to China or Russia to be some beacon. They know those countries won't do it. When is America going to be the country that it was in the late 40s and through the 1960s when people believed in America? I think that's the kind of thing that a politician could say.
I agree, but I mean, I think
maybe your candidacy.
Possibly. We'll talk. I'm looking for a good advisor. But for example, I think something that's important is for Americans to get better at putting themselves in the shoes of people very different from themselves and seeing how those people perceive events. I think that's important in any strategic contest with both to see things from the point of view of both your allies and your enemies.
Absolutely.
But it's kind of a mushy-sounding thing to say when you're in the middle of what is being called with some validity a war. Anyway, it is.
Yes, that's true. But you have to make the case to Americans that you don't win a war only with force, although force is sometimes necessary, and people have to know that you're willing to use it. You also win a war with ideals. I mean, one of the fascinating things about Bush's campaign, right? I mean, it's true that Bush seemed tough, but Bush also, I think, got a lot of mileage in 2004 because people thought that he believed in America. He believed that America had this great mission in the world. They might have thought that he didn't know all the details, but they liked the fact that he was talking about America doing these great things. That as we had earlier in the century, it's John Kerry who never really had a story about how America was going to safeguard itself by creating a better world. That's not just military force. That's the kind of idealism that resides in the American people.
No, he was your classic focus group candidate, and he exhibited all the perils, and was a problematic personality to begin with. I voted for him in spite of all that.
Nothing like you'll be when you run, Bob.
No, you'll get the real Bob, man. And speaking of which, in the vacillation between adversarial and conciliatory that we've seen on my end in the course of this conversation, I'm going to quickly dart back to adversarial. Speaking of putting yourself in the shoes of other people, there's a line in your book, as an alliance of 26 democracies, NATO has at least as much moral authority as the Security Council. Now the UN Security Council, that is. Now, democracy is important, but certainly you would agree that in a place like, say, Indonesia, it's not at all clear that NATO carries more moral authority than the United Nations Security Council, right? I mean, it seems to me that's an example of a kind of a view we need to be careful about.
Well, what I say in the book, I think actually just around that same time, is that the model should be NATO partnering with regional organizations. One of the good examples actually is East Timor, where Australia was involved, the United States helped out, but we also had the help of an umbrella organization of, let's put it frankly, non-white post-colonial governments. That, I think, is really the model. I think if you're talking outside of Europe, it would be better not to do NATO alone. But NATO is really the organization that right now can get things done. What you want is NATO's muscle, it seems to me, with the kind of legitimacy that you get from other kinds of regional organizations. But you have to have the capacity to go outside the UN. You know, time and again, we saw this in Kosovo, we saw this in 1947 with Greece and Turkey. Time and again, the UN, because of one country like China or Russia, will not act.
Right, but that's what's so frustrating about the Iraq War. On the eve of the war, Bush had, although this wasn't his aim, provided an opportunity to give the UN a whole new kind of credibility in the realm of weapons inspections. Because he'd been intent on war, he had brought the troops in, so Hussein had let the inspectors in, and there was an opportunity to do something with that. But anyway, he went another path. Let me, we talked about how disliked you are in some parts of the left. Let me read something to you and give you a chance to respond.
Sure.
This is the first post in response to the Kevin Drum item I mentioned. And Kevin had talked about how you admit that you were wrong in Iraq and so on. And this person writes, about you. So he's willing to admit he was wrong, sort of, as long as his wrong faction retains control of the party, and as long as the people who are right don't gain any influence. And as long as he can continue to call the people who are right squishes. Actually, I think he's taking a Kevin paraphrasal there and misattributing it to you. Although maybe you have called them squishes. And then the guy says, that's big of him. Now, that is, I think that's part of the attitude here. And I always, to some extent, feel it myself toward people who supported the Iraq War and then proceed to opine on how things could be conducted. Is just kind of, wait a second, you were wrong big time. And now you're telling me what to do. That's the spirit. Do you think it's misguided or unfair?
Well, I think it's unfair to say that I think that everyone who was against the Iraq War was a squish, and somehow I don't think that their views are valuable. Even in that 2004 essay, as I said, I was actually praising two Democratic presidential candidates who were against the war. So that's not the point that I made at all. As to whether people who were wrong on a big thing like the Iraq War should therefore basically shut up and not give their opinions on foreign policy. If that were the standard, it seems to me, if you looked at the record on the left and in the Democratic Party from the Gulf War through Kosovo today, you would be basically eliminating more than upwards of 90% of the people. Al Gore might still be around, to his credit, because he supported the Gulf War and supported Kosovo and opposed this one. But most people, if they've been around long enough, have gotten one thing pretty majorly wrong. And it seems to me that the right thing to do when you do that is to think hard about why you got it wrong, try to write openly about it, and say what you've learned. And that's what I tried to do.
Okay. Now, we're under time constraints here, so we're going to have to wrap it up. But two quick things. One is just a follow-up to that. Are you doing any kind of...
I do have to leave in a minute. I have to leave in a minute.
One is, are things getting better between you and those people on the left, or have you given up? Is there an outreach program?
My outreach program is having people read the book. I mean, honestly, I think that when people read the book, there's lots they can disagree with about the book. But I think if people read the book, they'll have a thoughtful, interesting response. I'll learn from their response. It's harder when people haven't read the book, needless to say, because they may be attributing things that you supposedly have said that aren't actually in the book. So if I have an outreach program, it's for people to read the book and then make their decision.
Yeah, you do. I got to say, you do a very good mea culpa in the beginning, and that is the smart thing to do, and they should read it. I'm holding the book up now while I ask the final question, which is, there's a line out there that basically the New Republic's foreign policy is actually neocon, and yes, they're liberal on some domestic issues, but you were editor of the New Republic until pretty recently. What are the differences between the New Republic's foreign policy, especially as it was being espoused before Iraq, and neoconservatism?
Well, first of all, the neocons are completely blind to the contradiction between trying to dismantle government at home and have American government be a force for freedom and security around the world. They've never reconciled the fact that they've made alliance with a conservative movement that basically has been trying to tear down government at the very time when we need government to be doing all kinds of things in homeland security, in anti-proliferation, in supporting democracy and economic development. They haven't reconciled that, and because they haven't, they've gone down with George W. Bush this path towards fiscal crisis where America's not going to have the money to invest in homeland security or even the military that they claim they want to. But beyond that, and the book stresses this a lot, neoconservatives are hostile to international institutions. They don't believe America needs to legitimize itself around the world through anything but our own good intentions. That fundamentally is not my view. My belief is that America has to prove that it's a benign force in the world, and one of the ways it does that is by embedding its power in international institutions so that we persuade other people rather than simply coerce. We don't ask them to take our virtue on faith, but we prove it to them by giving them some influence over our power.
Well, I'm in favor of that, and I'm also in favor of it because the cost-benefit ratio is a lot better if we're not the only ones doing the job out there and catching the blowback.
I agree.
Well, thanks a lot. Good luck with the book.
Thanks a lot.
I'm holding it up now for the 4th time, so I don't really see how it fails to hit the bestseller list at this point.